Abu Hanifa is more conspicuously concerned with theology than any of the Imams of law. And in fact, the great schools that come out of the Hanafi tradition, at the head of them, the Maturidi school of theology, they all have very clearly the imprint of Abu Hanifa. And in many ways, they're the most brilliant theological schools that Muslims ever preserved. They are schools that really powerfully combine all the different elements of the theological discourse without going to extremes one way or the other. The poem of At-Tahawi in Aqidah is in fact a Hanafi poem, and it also follows a Hanafi Aqidah. But Imam Abu Hanifa also developed that in his own ways, and it's really the Maturidis who develop it rationalistically and who create a very brilliant theological system. So usually wherever you have Hanafis, you will have Maturidis. Where you have Shafi'is, you have Ash'aris. But that's a later development. And then most of the Malikis will also become Ash'aris, but that's also an even later development than it was among the Shafi'is. In the case of the Hanbalis, they tend to be Salafi. They tend to keep a Salafi theology. And in the case of the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and his descendants, like the modern Salafis, their point of view about that Salafi theology is extremely important to them. And it's often very distinctive. Whether it agrees with what Imam Ahmad taught or not, that would be a point of debate, and their opponents would say no, and they would of course say yes. But the Hanbali school, as it develops in Islamic history, is one that becomes famed for its witch hunts, because later on, especially when it becomes dominant in the lower classes of Baghdad or of Damascus, it tends to be very virulent in its defense of the Salafi position of Ahmad bin Hanbal as it understands it. And therefore it tends to be very anti-Shia, very anti-Mu'tazila, and sometimes anti-Ash'ari and anti-Maturidi. And with this kind of a development, which we don't really have in the life of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, you have also very sharp theological lines that are drawn within Sunni circles. And this would probably be the biggest division within Sunni circles, is that division between a Hanbali Aqidah and between the belief systems of the other Sunnis. So you have very different ways of thinking here, and often you have even estrangement and alienation, which almost becomes sometimes sectarian in its nature.
What are the primary differences between Hanbali theology and Hanafi Maturidi theology?
Well, again, Hanbali theology as such is not a monolithic thing. And a lot of Hanbalis have written tracts to say that Ahmad ibn Hanbal is no different from any of the other early Salaf figures. And the key issue here is the issue of anthropomorphism. I mean, that's one of the key issues. And the old Salafi position was not to interpret. So when you are faced with a verse of the Quran or a hadith that speaks of God in human terms or in bodily terms, that will say, for example, that God sat on his throne, or the most merciful, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, the most merciful assumed the throne. He took the throne. Or a verse that refers to the hands of the most merciful, or the eyes of the most merciful, or a hadith that refers to God coming down to the seventh heaven in the last part of the night, or talking about the Jabbar, the compeller, putting his foot in hell. And there are many, many hadith like that. There are many verses like that that are essentially anthropomorphic. And these are called mutashabihat. The Quran says that that God revealed the book, that it had minhu ayatun muhkamat. Some of the verses in it are of definitive meaning. Hunna ummul kitab. They are the basis of the book. They're the foundation of the book. In other words, that's what you depend on. You reason on the basis. وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ, and there are others that have ambiguities, like the most merciful to assume the throne. So then it says that the people who seek division and so forth, they follow the mutashabihat. And the other ones follow the muhkamat. That's what those verses are about. Now, in the case of these anthropomorphic verses, the Salaf would not interpret them, not one way or the other. They would say that this is what God has said, this is true, we believe in it, and it has a meaning that is appropriate for the Creator who is unlike His creation. So whatever it means, it's not anthropomorphic. They were not anthropomorphists. One of the problems with a lot of the Hanbalis that were regarded to be anthropomorphic, and some of them were, was that they began to take this literally. That God actually has a hand. He actually has an eye. And especially among the modern Salafis and the modern Wahhabis, even though it's very hard to hold them down to this, especially their scholars, but in the way they talk to the public and in their attacks upon rationalist theology, they're really taking anthropomorphic positions. And they will speak about these things in bodily terms. I've heard that many times. I've heard some of the great sheikhs of the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia say things about God's in heaven, He's not in earth, which is absurd. And of course it's against the Quran, because it says that He's Allah in the heavens and the earth. And then the reasoning that this sheikh gave was that if God were in the earth, He'd also be in the toilets, which is idiocy. Because again, in basic rationalist theology, it's very clear that nothing that pertains to temporal beings can pertain to God. So He's not connected to anything, and He's not disconnected to anything. And He's not physically near to anything, and He's not physically far away. He's not transcendent, and He's not immanent in a physical sense, because He's totally other. He's not created. He's not in time and space. He's the Lord of time and space. He's the Lord of the past, the present, and the future. He's not waiting for the future to happen to know what's going to be. God is utterly different than you and I. So, this anthropomorphic wing in the Hanbalis and in then the others that come from them, like the Wahhabis and the Salafis, this is one of the biggest issues. There are also other issues. But among the Salaf, the early generation, anything that was anthropomorphic or mutashabih, they would just leave as it was. And then, as time went by, which wasn't very much time, you have the rationalist theologians. And this is, of course, in the 3rd, the 9th century. And they are compelled to interpret. And they do that. And they themselves will say, the Salaf were safer, and we are more knowledgeable. They don't mean it in the way it comes out in English, but they would say, as Salaf, they would say the way of the Salaf is Aslam, and the way of the Khalaf is A'lam. It has more knowledge in it. What they mean to say is that if you don't interpret, you're safer with God, because you're not likely to make a mistake. But if you do interpret correctly, there's more knowledge in that, and that knowledge is very important so that people don't misunderstand. So they lived in a time when real anthropomorphism had appeared, and also when total rejection of anthropomorphism had appeared to the extent that maybe it even denied attributes. So then they would take positions where they would interpret. And Abu Hanifa is a master of the old Salafi way, but he opens the door to the new. And they would say, for example, that the hearts of the servant are between the 2 fingers of the most merciful. He turns it over however he wills. And they would say that is will and power, for example.